This is lecture 1 from chapter 17, our last chapter, and this is about ecosystems and communities. So what we're going to be looking at here are how organisms interact with each other and how organisms interact with their environment. So we're going to start off talking about ecosystems, and ecosystems are looking at two different parts. Each ecosystem contains these two parts. The first part is the biotic part of the ecosystem, the living part of the ecosystem. So this is all of the living organisms that are in an area. We often will call this a community. So if you look over in our picture here for the coral reef, you've got all different types of organisms. So we've got multiple different species of fish. They're all through here. You've got multiple different species of coral. Almost all of these are different species of coral that are in here. Tucked down in here are probably also crabs and octopus. You also have microbes, so we know that there are microbes that are going to be down in there that we can't see. Up on land, we've got all the different trees and plants and probably insects and so forth that are up there. So quite a wide variety of living organisms. The other half of an ecosystem is the abiotic, or the non-living part of the environment. We often call this the habitat. These are the chemical resources that are in the environment and the physical conditions. So the chemical resources for this area, little easy to see one of them, it's the water, right? But also things like the air. You've got sand up here. And also it would be things like the nutrients in the water. Those would be chemical resources. And then physical conditions, we can see it just off the side here, but things like sunlight and temperature, those would be types of physical conditions, rainfall, that determine what can live in that area. Now, ecosystems don't have to be big. They can be small. So this beetle that we're looking at in this picture could actually be an ecosystem, because that beetle is going to be carrying around things like microbes and possibly parasites. So you can have small little ecosystems because there's also going to be abiotic parts, the temperatures and so forth that are going to influence the ecosystem that's on this beetle. So what we're going to look at next are actually not the little types of ecosystems, but what we call biomes. These are big versions of ecosystems. So biomes are basically they are basically big ecosystems. We use biomes to describe areas of the world that have similar plants and animals and conditions that we can compare. So they are determined, as you can see, by temperature and rainfall. And we can see general patterns, as we'll see this coming up in this section. There are patterns around the world because of temperature and rainfall for these ecosystems. So we're going to focus on terrestrial biomes, so the land biomes. And what we look at for these biomes and what influences what can grow there and what can live there are things like the average temperature. So we will look at what is the average temperature year-round in an area. And we'll also look at the average rainfall or precipitation. Why do we have to say precipitation? Well, you've lived in Ohio for some amount of time, so you know that rain is not the only way that you get water falling on ground. So we also look at things like snow and hail and things like that to determine precipitation because those other forms will actually melt. And in some biomes, actually the precipitation is fog, so it's not normal rainfall. Now, those are overall year-long temperatures, but for some areas in the world, that's not enough information. So we also want to know, is the temperature constant? So does it stay that average temperature year round, or does it vary seasonally? So does the area have seasons like we have here in Ohio? Same thing for the rainfall. Does it rain year round, or do they get all of the rain at one time? Or is the rain very sporadic? Does it only rain a little bit here, a little bit there? Because this is going to determine what can live in that area. So the biomes, this temperature and precipitation that we've been talking a little bit about, are going to dictate what we call the primary productivity levels. So what does that mean? Primary productivity is talking about plants. So the amount of precipitation and how warm it gets is going to determine how much plant material is going to be produced, or the amount of organic matter is going to get produced, and it's also going to determine what kinds of plant life can grow there. So if you think about it, for example, you can't grow banana trees in Ohio, at least not outside, because it gets too cold here. So those kinds of temperature and precipitation patterns are going to tell you what kinds of plants can actually grow in an area and how much. If you think about it, when it gets cold, you're probably not going to get as big of plants or as many plants. Why do we care? Because the primary producers, the plants, are going to determine how many and how many types of other life you get in an area. So if you have lots of different plants and lots of them, you're going to probably have lots of different organisms in that area as far as animals and fungi and microbes. If you're very limited on the amount of plants that you have as far as variety and as far as number, you're probably not going to have as many organisms in that area in the other groups of animals, fungi, and so forth. So these patterns of temperature and precipitation are really important for the biomes. So what we're going to look at now is we're going to just kind of look at some of the different terrestrial biomes. So what we're going to be looking at is, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these guys and where they are found on the planet. And I'm actually going to start this in a new lecture so that I can get it all in one lecture. I don't want to run out of time. So I'll pick this up in lecture 2 for this chapter.